Hello and welcome to another video for the English at Penrice YouTube channel. Today we're going to be having a look at exploring the poem Tissue by Imtiaz Dharker. This is one of the poems from the GCSE Anthology, and you'll be answering a question on one of the poems from the anthology in your English Literature, paper 2. Let's start by reading through the poem. Tissue by Imtiaz Dharker. Paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching. The kind you find in well-used books. The back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories. Who was born to whom. The height and weight. Who died where and how. On which sepia date. Pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps too, the sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers, over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked and thin to be transparent, turned into your skin. Okay, let's start by having a look at some of Imtiaz Dharker's own comments on her poem. She's replied to students on Twitter, and Imtiaz Dharker's also taken part in an event called Poetry Live, where some of the anthology poets talk about their poems and their meanings and their ideas. So these are comments by the poet about her own poem. So it's really important that we take into account what she said she meant by everything. So the first thing that Imtiaz Dharker has said about her poem is that it's about the importance of considering different ways of living and looking at the way we live our lives and potentially finding freedom in those different ways of approaching life. She's also said that we should value the personal, and that's a key idea in the poem. So the things that tell the stories of our lives and our families and our cultural identities. And then in valuing the personal, we gain freedom and happiness, and we avoid conflict. She's also told us that she focuses on light as a really powerful entity in her poem, and that light can break through rigid structures that human beings try to create and impose on our lives. It might also be a comment that nature is more powerful than humans who think they are powerful and controlling, but actually light and nature is much more powerful than we are. Then she's also told us that the poem is a comment on how rigid structures imposed by humans, whether that's social structures such as class systems, religious structures, from religious buildings to what they symbolise, so religious teachings, or even national structures like country borderlines, laws and regulations, and how those rigid structures created by human beings can actually cause conflict and unhappiness rather than freedom. And finally, one key idea that she has shared about her poem is that human life is delicate, that tissue, including human skin and tissue, is fragile, and this is reflected in our temporary, delicate human lives. Okay, let's move on to exploring the poem in a little bit more detail now. We're going to look at it stanza by stanza, taking into account and considering some methods, some language and structural methods that Imtiaz Dharker uses to convey some key ideas and effects to us as the reader. Let's start with the opening line then. Paper that lets the light shine through. Now we've got this repetition of this idea of paper as a motif throughout the poem, and paper as a powerful entity is important, not only to record things but also to control us, but also as a fragile entity, as something that doesn't last forever. So the paper that lets the light shine through is the very opening reference to paper here, and it's linked to this idea of light, which is used by lots of poets as a symbol of hope and energy, happiness and life. Now, linking this idea of light to paper shows that paper can be a positive force for good in our lives, that actually if we look at paper in a different way, as something that can record things, something that can be very precious, but something temporary, it can actually be a positive thing in our lives. And this creates a really optimistic tone to start the poem. This paper then, she says, is the kind of paper that you find in well-used books, for example, the religious text, the Quran. And these kind of books are often used to record personal histories. In fact, Dharker actually saw her own date of birth written by her father in one such book, and that's probably what inspired her to link to include this reference. So the Quran and other family books, maybe religious texts, are used to record birth dates, death dates, families and their backgrounds. And the idea that this creates an identity for a family or an individual is also linked to religion and culture through the reference to the Quran. And that's a really, really powerful link. So the power of our identity, the power of recording our history, our personal history, but also the power of our beliefs and our lives and our memories through recording it in such texts as religious books. We've also got in the third stanza a list of very tender, affectionate verbs to link to this idea of the paper pages. They are smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. Again, she's emphasising here the respectful, affectionate treatment of paper and the importance we put on paper in such books, as she mentions in stanza 2. The idea of the paper being turned transparent, however, this is repeated in the penultimate stanza of the poem, actually alludes to how fragile paper can be, that it doesn't last forever, and that actually it can become thinner and more delicate over time and with age. And that links to the delicacy of human life as well. Again, something that doesn't last forever. And then in the fourth stanza, we seem to have a shift in mood. Imtiaz Dharker refers to buildings being made of paper, and that if they were built of paper, we would be moving away from the importance we place on rigid structures of stone or brick or block. And if paper was used, we would maybe have more of an acceptance that things change and develop and things are temporary. And that's reinforced by these transient verbs that link to movement, falling away, drifting, shifting, and this idea that things don't last forever and don't stay the same forever, but change. And actually that can be a powerful thing, Dharker is saying to us, that this acceptance that things shouldn't last forever, even things like buildings, is a very freeing idea for human beings. This idea is continued in the 5th stanza. It starts with the minor sentence, maps to. Now this minor sentence and then that full stop, which is a caesura because it appears in the middle of the line, reflects that actually maps can be very limiting and fixed. Human beings try to impose order and boundaries on natural places. And that really juxtaposes with the freedom that she was talking about in stanza 4, of things moving and changing if they were built of paper. But also here in this same stanza, that rigidity and limiting nature of maps is contrasted with sunlight again. And she says that the sun shines through the borderlines of maps. So even though human beings try to impose borders and a rigid structure on places, governments try to create boundaries between countries, sunlight doesn't recognise these borders. Nature, rivers, mountain folds, they traverse those boundaries and they don't pay attention to humans and the order we try to impose on them. A little note about structure at this point as well. A key structural feature that Imtiaz Dharker uses is enjambment, and just a reminder that that's when the poet doesn't use punctuation at the end of a line. And we can see that enjambment really clearly in stanza 4 and 5, when she's talking about the movement of buildings if they were made of paper, and she's talking about the movement of sunlight through those borderlines that we try to impose with things like maps. And that enjambment, that lack of punctuation at the end of the lines, creates a really free-flowing pace that mirrors that sense of the need for change, to move forward and to break away from rigid, controlled structures that we try to create to gain power. Imtiaz Dharker then moves on to talk about how perhaps we can be controlled by the power of money, and that paper in this instance actually is symbolic of something less personal. So here we have fine slips from grocery shops representing receipts that tell us how much we've paid, what we've bought. But actually, in this case, the paper that's less personal, these receipts, actually controls us, and perhaps we can become obsessed with money. However, she says, as we move into the next stanza, that all of these things that create a record of our lives, so the histories written in the Quran, the maps that we create, the receipts that we collect, perhaps collecting all of this paper and using it to build with these layers that she mentions, these layers of scripts, actually hints at a different way of living. That collecting things that are more personal and human and creating things like buildings from this could actually lead to freedom and optimism. And she's hinting there that we might never wish to build again with rigid and more permanent materials like brick or block, which suggests that maybe when we try to build with things like brick or block or stone, conflict arises because we can't see a way of changing or of moving forward, because those things are very rigid and very oppressive. She mentions an architect in this stanza, somebody who creates, somebody who builds, and that's really important because an architect has the opportunity to create something new. The architect could refer to us as human beings perhaps, or even to a god, not necessarily a Christian god, but any god. In the next stanza, she mentions the pride that comes with building solid structures, so stone structures like monoliths or capitals, so brick or stone, creating huge towns or cities perhaps. And there's a hint that she's criticising human pride here, and the fact that we think we as humans are very powerful when we create these structures, which are imposing and controlling, but actually perhaps can become quite oppressive and unchanging. And so that critical tone maybe links to this idea in that fourth stanza that she thinks that paper would be a lot more freeing and a lot more positive if we created things with it, and a lot more personal. And then moving towards the end of the poem then, we have a comparison here with the paper that's been talked about as a motif throughout, with human tissue and human skin. And this comparison with paper, as described in stanza 3 as transparent and treated with affection and respect, perhaps reinforces the need for humans to respect the personal and the human and the cultural, as well as accepting our human delicacy and the fact that we as human beings don't last forever, and our power certainly doesn't either. Finally then, we have the one-line final stanza, which compares the fragile nature of paper, this tissue that Imtiaz Dharker has suggested we should use to create new things and new buildings, and it compares it to human skin. Imtiaz Dharker uses that second person pronoun your to directly address us as a reader, that maybe is encouraging us to accept how transient our lives are, how temporary our lives are, and that actually we need to be. Okay, that was an exploration of the poem Tissue by Imtiaz Dharker. It's a great poem with lots of different layers of meaning and possible readings. Please sign up to the English at Penrice YouTube channel for lots more videos to help you revise for your English GCSE literature and language exams.